Iran during the Second World War. From the beginning of the Second World War and the attack of Nazi Germany on the USSR, despite the formal declaration of neutrality by Iran, the activities of the fascist agents in Iran, with the full encouragement of the government of Reza Shah, intensified even more. Iran has become the main base for the activities of fascist agents in the Middle East. After the failure of the fascist adventures in Iraq and Syria, Hitler's intelligence agents, as well as local pro-fascist elements, rushed to Iran from these countries. Iranian reactionary circles decided that this was not a favorable moment for the revival of ancient encroachments on the Soviet territory of Transcaucasia. The Nazis supplied the pro-fascist elements in Iran with weapons and money. Hostile to the Soviet Union and Iran, the activities of fascist German agents and subversive groups created by them on Iranian territory assumed a threatening character. In more than 50 Iranian institutions, German agents made their way to important, leading positions. By every means they sought to restore Iran against the Soviet Union, to draw it into a war against the USSR, as well as to disrupt the peaceful life of the Iranian people, to cause unrest and confusion in Iran, by turning Iranian territory into an arena for preparing a military attack on the USSR. The fascist agents trampled upon the elementary demands of respect for Iran's sovereignty in the most rude and insolent way. Under the guise of representatives of various commercial, industrial, and other firms in Iran, numerous fascist agents and intelligence agents carried out subversive activities. They organized armed sabotage and terrorist groups from White Guards, Dashnaks, and Mossavists at the border points with the USSR in Iran to transfer them to Soviet Azerbaijan. Primarily to the most important Soviet oil region Baku, to the Grozny region, and also to Soviet Turkmenistan. These groups were preparing to commit arson, explosions and terrorist acts on the territory of the USSR. In the northern regions of Iran bordering the USSR, warehouses of weapons and explosives were arranged. In the vicinity of Miana, for example, over 50 tons of explosives were prepared. Warehouses of weapons and ammunition were also arranged in the Iranian Julfa and in other places. Explosions were being prepared for a large railway tunnel, about 3 kilometers long, in the Firuzkoh region, a large stone bridge on the Mionzanjan road, and other objects of great strategic importance. In the points on the border with the USSR, Hitler's agents, without any interference, made topographic surveys of the area, photographed border objects. More than 50 fascist intelligence agents were operating at Iranian military enterprises under the guise of engineers and technicians. In Tabriz, Resht, Pahlavi, Kazvin and other cities of northern Iran, local secret fascist groups were created, which sometimes acted under the auspices of the local police. In Tehran, Hamadan, Mion and other places there were secret mobile fascist radio transmission stations. Hitler's agents widely launched false, demagogic fascist propaganda in Iran. In Tehran, a fascist bulletin was published in Persian, which was sent free of charge to prominent government officials, merchants, and various institutions and firms. Many Tehran newspapers, including the semi-official Etelat and Journal de Tehran, were bribed by the Nazis and received subsidies from them. Trying to draw Iran into the war against the USSR, the German envoy in Tehran offered Reza Shah military assistance. Germany demanded that Iranian air bases be transferred to it. In case the fascist agents failed to draw Iran into the war against the USSR, the Nazis were preparing a military coup in the country. In connection with the preparation of this coup, in early August 1941, Admiral Canaris, one of the leaders of the intelligence of fascist Germany, arrived in Tehran under the guise of a representative of a little-known German company, equipped with huge amounts of counterfeit money intended for bribery. Under the leadership of Canaris's closest associate, Major Frisch, special fascist battalions were created in Tehran from the Germans living in Tehran. Under the guise of hunting and tourist excursions, they underwent military training in the vicinity of Tehran. Together with a group of pro-fascist Iranian army officers involved in a fascist conspiracy, they were to form a strike group for a military coup, which was scheduled for Friday, August 22, 1941. and then postponed to August 28. The fascist bandits were first of all going to cut out the staff of the Soviet embassy in Tehran, and all Soviet citizens living in Iran. Thus, with the connivance and direct assistance of Reza Shah, Iran was turned by the Nazis into a springboard for an attack on the USSR. In the first months after the attack of fascist Germany on the Soviet Union, the government of the USSR 3 times, on June 26, July 19, and August 16, 1941, warned the Iranian government about the threat. But the Shah and the government headed by Ali Mansur did not pay attention to these warnings, and did not take measures to suppress the activities of the fascist agents. Then, on August 25, 1941, on the basis of Article 6 of the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921, the Soviet government was forced to send its troops to the territory of Iran, handing the Iranian government a note motivating the need for this act. At the same time, British troops entered Iran from the west and south. On August 27, Ali Mansur's cabinet resigned. A new government was formed, headed by Fauruji, who ordered all the armed forces of Iran to refrain from resisting the Soviet and British troops. On August 28, the Iranian Majlis approved this order and passed a vote of confidence in the new government. Then negotiations began between the USSR, Britain and Iran, which ended on September 8 with the conclusion of an agreement that provided for the withdrawal of Iranian troops from a number of regions, and the occupation of these regions by Soviet, in northern Iran, and British, in southwestern Iran, troops. The agreement provided for a certain time frame for the removal from Iran of all German agents and diplomatic missions of Germany, Italy and Hitler's satellite states. Being forced to accept these conditions, Reza Shah tried to prevent the fulfillment of the obligations assumed by the Iranian government. The Iranian police, on the instructions of the Shah, provided all possible protection to the fascist agents. As a result, many German agents were able to hide and continue their fascist activities in Iran. On September 10, 1941, at the direction of Reza Shah, an editorial was published in the semi-official newspaper Etelat, deploring the closure of the German and Italian missions. The departure of the German, Italian and other missions was postponed from day to day. Such a pro-fascist policy of Reza Shah caused discontent among the masses, which manifested itself in some places in the form of open demonstrations. Convinced of the final failure of his policy, on September 16, Reza Shah abdicated and left for Isfahan. The eldest son of Reza Shah, and his heir Mohammad Reza, was elevated to the throne. Official representatives of Nazi Germany and its satellites, as well as most of their numerous agents, were interned and deported. Some fascist agents managed to escape. Taking advantage of the patronage and assistance of the fascist agents among the Iranians, they continued their underground subversive activities. Soon after the entry of Soviet and British troops into Iran, negotiations began between the governments of the USSR, Great Britain, and Iran to conclude an alliance. Despite the opposition of pro-fascist circles, who tried to disrupt the conclusion of the treaty, the negotiations ended successfully. On January 29, 1942, an alliance agreement was signed between the USSR, Great Britain, and Iran. The Allies pledged to respect the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and political independence of Iran. The USSR and England also pledged to defend Iran with all the means at their disposal against any aggression on the part of Germany or any other power. In order to carry out this task, the USSR and Britain received the right to maintain on Iranian territory land, sea and air forces in such numbers as they deem necessary. The treaty established that the troops of the USSR and England should be withdrawn from the territory of Iran no later than 6 months after the cessation of hostilities between the Allied states and Germany with its accomplices. It was determined that until the same date the treaty as a whole would be in force. Iran, in turn, committed itself to cooperate with the Allied states by all means available to it and in all possible ways so that they can fulfill the above obligations. The assistance of the Iranian armed forces, however, was limited by agreement only to maintaining order on Iranian territory. In addition, the Allied states were granted an unlimited right to use, maintain, protect and, in case of military necessity, control all means of communication throughout Iran, including railways, highways and dirt roads, rivers, airfields, ports, etc. The entry of Soviet troops into Iran, and the conclusion of the treaty in 1942 frustrated the plans of the fascist aggressors and their Iranian minions, saved Iran from the threat of complete enslavement by fascist Germany and ensured its cooperation with the countries of the anti-Hitler coalition. The invariably friendly policy of the USSR towards Iran was formulated with the utmost clarity by Stalin in his report on November 6, 1941. We do not have and cannot have such war goals as the seizure of foreign territories, the subjugation of foreign peoples. It doesn't matter whether we are talking about the peoples and territories of Europe, or the peoples and territories of Asia, including Iran. The entry of Soviet troops into Iran and the Tripartite Alliance Treaty of 1942 were of great positive significance for the successful conduct of the war against fascist Germany. Forced to go underground, the Nazi agents continued their subversive activities even after the Allied troops entered Iran. To help the Nazi agents who managed to escape from the Allied authorities, Hitler's spies and saboteurs were additionally transferred to Iran. In 1942, they created the underground fascist organization Milliyun Iran, Iranian nationalists. The German fascist agents, together with the organization Milliyun Iran, carried out sabotage and terrorist activities, provoked uprisings of tribes, sought to disable highways and railways, etc. Thus, in the Rize region, in northwestern Iran, the Nazi agents succeeded in 1942 to provoke the performance of the Kurdish tribes. In the south of Iran, in Fars, using the widespread dissatisfaction among the tribes with the chauvinistic policy of the Iranian government and anti-British sentiments, the fascist German agents also provoked the tribes in every possible way to oppose the Iranian government and allies. In 1942 and 1943, armed actions of the Kashkai, Lur and some Berkshire tribes repeatedly took place. The Khans of the tribes demanded the return to them of the lands taken by Reza Shah, their appointment as rulers of those districts and regions where the tribes lived, providing food to the tribes and reducing taxes and prices for goods, withdrawal of Allied troops from Iran. After long negotiations between the South Iranian Khans and representatives of the Iranian government and the British, some of the demands of the Khans were satisfied, and the anti-government protests of the tribes ceased. The main role in stopping the pro-fascist actions of the South Iranian tribes was played by the defeat of the Nazi troops near Stalingrad by the Soviet Army and the further victories of the Soviet Union. They showed the tribal Khans and other Iranian reactionaries associated with the Nazis that betting on Nazi Germany did not bode well for them. Subsequently, in 1944, the Nazi agents, who had previously been hidden by the Khans of the Kashkai tribes, were handed over to the last British. On the basis of the tripartite Anglo-Soviet-Iranian Treaty of Alliance, military equipment and materials were transported through Iran to the USSR. By providing its territory and means of communication, the Trans-Iranian Railway and highways, for the transit of allies, Iran contributed to the fight against the fascist bloc. The formal declaration of war on Germany on September 9, 1943, by Iran, had no real military significance. Iranian troops did not participate in hostilities against Germany and its allies, and Iran's assistance to the allies, as before the declaration of war on Germany, was limited to transit traffic. In the Declaration of the Three Powers on Iran, adopted on December 1, 1943, at the Conference of the Leaders of the Three Allied Powers held in Tehran, the assistance provided by Iran in the conduct of the war was noted, especially by facilitating the transportation of goods from abroad to the Soviet Union. However, the US government in the declaration, the USSR and Great Britain declared their consent to continue to provide Iran with possible economic assistance and reaffirmed their desire to preserve the full independence, sovereignty and territorial integrity of Iran. True to its obligations, the Soviet Union, despite the war, provided Iran with great assistance. It sent industrial goods and food that were urgently needed for it, in particular, in 1943, when famine threatened Tehran, it sent 25,000 tons of wheat there. A large amount of grain was also sent by the Soviet Union to the northern regions of Iran and even to Khuzestan. In addition, Soviet military units located in Iran provided the Iranian population with free medical care, repaired old and built new roads, built artesian wells, etc. Soviet scientists and doctors fought locusts and epidemics. Soviet hospitals were opened in Tehran and other Iranian cities. The Soviet Iranian Society for Cultural Relations organized houses of culture in Tehran, Tabriz and other places, which conducted extensive cultural and educational work among the population, lectures, reports, films, etc. As for the policy of Britain and the United States in Iran, it must be borne in mind that the real goals of the reactionary circles of Britain and the United States in relation to Iran in no way corresponded to the desire proclaimed in the declaration of the three Allied powers on Iran to preserve the complete independence and sovereignty of Iran. On the contrary, they decided to use the Second World War to subjugate Iran and turn it into their protectorate. Their intentions did not at all include the liberation of Iran from the domination of the reactionary forces, which are an instrument of imperialist policy, as well as the implementation of fundamental democratic reforms in the country. Directly opposite was the attitude of the USSR towards Iran, which always, and during the Second World War in particular, pursued a policy of assistance to Iran in the struggle to strengthen its economic and political independence. Allied transit services were also useful to Iran, as they gave work to tens of thousands of Iranian workers. The cessation of transportation in the spring of 1945 immediately adversely affected the economic situation of the country. Many thousands of workers were left without work, and unemployment in Iran worsened even more. The August events of 1941, the abdication of the Shah, the conclusion of the Soviet Anglo-Iranian Tripartite Treaty of Alliance, the break with Nazi Germany and the subsequent declaration of war on it had a great influence on the development of social and political life in Iran. In the autumn of 1941, political prisoners were released, leaders of the democratic movement, thrown into prisons and exiled under Reza Shah. The country began to awaken to democratic life. Democratic newspapers began to be published. On the initiative of a group of democratic figures, who were released from prisons and returned from exile, the People's Party of Iran was formed in October 1941, which soon united broad sections of workers, democratic intelligentsia, and other progressive elements. In 1942, the first, illegal, conference of the People's Party was held in Tehran, in which by that time there were already about 4,000 members, of which 80% were workers. The rest were intellectuals. In Gilan, Mazandaran, Azerbaijan, Khorasan and Isfahan there were regional party committees. The first conference of the People's Party discussed the question of the speedy creation of party organizations in the localities. Adopted a resolution on the struggle against fascism and internal reaction, adopted a provisional program of the party, and elected a steering committee of 15 people, which acted until the election of the Central Committee at the first Congress of the party in 1944. The main points of the program of the People's Party were the implementation of democratic freedoms, the strengthening of the political and economic independence of Iran, the establishment of friendly relations with all allies, the implementation of laws on labor and social insurance, and other democratic demands. After that, trade unions were re-established. Peasant unions were organized in the villages, which, as a rule, adjoined the People's Party. The demands of the People's Party, trade unions and the democratic press, to carry out progressive democratic reforms in the country, to purge the state apparatus of pro-fascist and reactionary elements, henchmen of Reza Shah, and to fight the remnants of Reza Shah's dictatorship, were very popular among the broad masses of the people. The peoples of Iran hoped that after the abdication of Reza Shah and the entry of Iran into the coalition of powers fighting against fascist Germany, the consequences of the dictatorship of Reza Shah and the control of fascist agents would be eliminated in the country, that the people would be provided with elementary democratic freedoms. And that in a country that, by its socio-political building one of the most backward countries in Asia, elementary socio-economic reforms will be carried out. Within a short period of time, the People's Party became the largest and most massive political party in the country. By the time of the first Congress of the People's Party, which took place in the summer of 1944, it already had over 25,000 members, of which 75% were workers, 23% were intellectuals, and 2% were peasants. Among the members of the People's Party, there were 40% Persians, 40% Azerbaijanis, and 20% other nationalities. Already in the first months of the presence of Soviet troops in Iran, the prestige and popularity of the Soviet Union increased unusually among the Iranian population. The Iranians saw with their own eyes that the fabrications spread about the USSR and the Soviet army by the Nazis and their agents in Iran are nothing but provocative slander. Representatives of various segments of the Iranian population demanded the establishment of closer political, economic, and cultural relations between Iran and the USSR. But the demands of the broad masses of the people of Iran for the elimination of the consequences of the dictatorship of Reza Shah, for the implementation of democratic, economic, and political reforms, and for the strengthening of friendly relations with the USSR, encountered stubborn resistance from the reactionary elements, who, just as under Reza Shah, continued to retain power in their own countries. Hands. Important posts in ministries, in the army, police, and gendarmerie were still occupied by the same people who were in power during the period of Reza Shah's dictatorship. Until recently, closely associated with fascist Germany, these reactionary elements, frightened by the growth of the democratic movement in Iran and the popularity of the USSR, very quickly reoriented themselves and sought rapprochement with the imperialist forces of England and especially the United States. In September 1943, Said Ziauddin was brought to Iran by the British. After his flight from Iran in 1921, Said Zia spent many years in Palestine, where the British masters kept him, hoping to use him in the future. In connection with the arrival of Said Zia, the reactionary Iranian newspapers, commissioned by the British, raised a big fuss, advertising him as a great national figure and patriot. In order to raise the importance of Said Zia in the eyes of the people, a magnificent meeting was organized for him. A few days after his arrival, Said Zia was elected a deputy of the 14th Majlis from the city of Yazd and immediately became one of the central figures of the reaction. He bought a number of previously published newspapers and began to publish several new ones, Rad Imruz, Caravan, Khor, etc. Said Ziauddin also set about organizing his own party, Watan Motherland, which included the most reactionary landlords, merchants, officials, corrupt journalists associated with the imperialists, and various criminal rabble used for bandit attacks on workers and democratic figures. Said Zia bought one of the best buildings in the city, the Iran Club, for his party. Tehran newspapers wrote that a curious detail was revealed during the deal: this national figure and patriot did not even have an Iranian passport. At the same time, the newspapers published an extract from the Afghan Yearbook, Kabul, 4 1932-33, on the 259th page of which, among the foreign travelers who visited Afghanistan that year, under no counting on the backwardness of the broad masses of the people of Iran and their prejudices, Said Zia, for the first time after his arrival in Iran, openly put forward a reactionary program. He advocated the resurrection of the veil, for the liberation of Iran from the influence of European culture, for a return to national traditions and the old Islamic feudal order. A symbol of a return to the past was an ancient fur hat, which was defiantly worn by Said Zia and his supporters. Putting forward such slogans, Said Zia and his masters hoped to use the general dissatisfaction of the people with the policy of Reza Shah, who carried out measures for the external Europeanization of Iran with dictatorial methods. In order to deceive the broad masses, Said Zia hypocritically pretended to be a friend of the USSR at first, speculating on the fact that when he was prime minister, the Soviet-Iranian Treaty of 1921 was signed. But Said Zia failed to deceive the people. His reactionary program evoked disgust and ridicule from all the progressive intelligentsia and progressive figures, who exposed Said Zia as an obscurantist reactionary, an alien mercenary, an enemy of culture, progress and civilization. His election to the Majlis under the threat of bayonets and machine guns aroused indignation among the general public of Iran. Many Iranian newspapers and parties demanded not to approve Said Zia's parliamentary mandate. The newspaper, Imrouz Fada, on March 8, 1944 wrote that not only limited circles or parties, but all freedom-loving and dictatorship-opposing people of all strata of society are against Said Zia, since he is an agent of reaction. Many prominent political figures of Iran and several dozen deputies of the Majlis opposed the approval of Said Zia's mandate in the Majlis. Speeches against Said Zia in the Majlis were enthusiastically welcomed by the public and journalists. Cries of death to the traitor Said Zia were repeatedly heard in the meeting room. On March 7 and 8, when the Majlis was discussing Said Zia's mandate, huge crowds of people gathered in front of the Majlis building and expressed indignation at Said Zia and his patrons. Said Zia's car was smashed, and after the meeting, Said Zia himself barely escaped with the help of the police from the indignant people. The Majlis nevertheless approved the mandate of Said Zia by a majority of 55 votes, with 28 against. There was nothing surprising in this, because the majority of the deputies, elected, as under Reza Shah, at the behest of the authorities and imperialists, consisted of reactionary landlords and former Reza Shah protégés. Of the 126 deputies who sat in the 14th Majlis, there were about 70 landowners, 13 merchants, and 2 manufacturers. Landowners. Further, the 14th Majlis included 9 newspaper editors, 6 lawyers, 2 clerics, 10 former clerics, etc. 8 deputies of the People's Party were elected to the 14th Majlis, which received over 150,000 votes in the elections out of approximately 2 million all those who took part in the voting. The election of Said Zia in Yezd under the threat of bayonets was not an isolated case. Open pressure on voters also took place in many other cities and districts. The purchase of ballot papers, the theft and replacement of ballot boxes after voting, the delay and cancellation of elections, etc. were widely used during elections. As a result, the 14th Majlis, whose meetings opened on February 26, 1944, became one of the main political imperialist patrons. Among its deputies there were many corrupt people, who used their deputy position for personal gain. The machinations and dark deeds among the deputies of the Majlis were so widespread, and of such a scandalous nature that one of his deputies, Dr. Mosaddegh, at an official meeting called the 14th Majlis a nest of thieves. The reactionary deputies of the Majlis quickly became close to Said Zia, who thus obtained the opportunity to influence the work of the Majlis, and use it as a weapon in the struggle against Iranian democracy, and as a tribune for anti-Soviet speeches. Acting through the Majlis, which enjoyed the right to appoint prime ministers, the reactionaries sought to set up cabinets that obediently carried out the instructions of the leaders of the Majlis, and the British and American imperialist circles behind them. As a result, the policy of the Iranian government began to take on an increasingly obvious anti-democratic and anti-Soviet character. This direction of the Iranian government's policy was especially pronounced in the autumn of 1944. Even from the end of 1943, the beginning of 1944, representatives of the British oil company Royal Dutch Shell and the American oil companies Standard Oil and Sinclair were in Tehran, with the Iranian government negotiations on obtaining concessions for oil development in Iranian Balochistan and other areas. The government was sympathetic to the proposals of British and American companies and paved the way for granting them concessions. In September 1944, a Soviet government commission arrived in Tehran, which entered into negotiations with the Syed government on granting the USSR a concession to develop oil in northern Iran. Despite the fact that the Soviet proposals were beneficial for Iran and their acceptance could contribute to the industrial development of its northern regions, as well as the development of the country's economy as a whole and the elimination of growing unemployment, the Iranian government decided not to grant concessions until the end of the war. Following that, on December 2, 1944, the Majlis hastily passed a law prohibiting the government from even entering into negotiations on granting oil concessions to foreign states and companies. The anti-Soviet nature of the behavior of the Iranian government and the Majlis, which tried to prevent rapprochement between the peoples of Iran and the USSR, was clear to everyone. Democratic parties, newspapers and figures criticized this policy, which was contrary to the national interests of Iran and directed against the USSR. Incited by Sayyid Zia, the Saad government responded with brutal repressions and even gave orders to disperse the popular rallies and demonstrations organized on November 7, 1944 in Tehran in honor of the anniversary of the Great October Socialist Revolution. The organizers of the demonstration, trade union activists, were arrested, signboards were torn down from the premises of the trade union clubs and the People's Party, and the club's premises were occupied by troops. Cavalry units, armored cars and motorcyclists, machine gunners were placed on the streets. Many democratic newspapers were closed. Such anti-democratic and anti-Soviet policies of the Sayyid government caused massive protests throughout the country. In Tehran, Tabriz, Rasht, Isfahan, Sultanabad, Arak, Mashhad and other cities of Iran, thousands of rallies and demonstrations of protest against the reactionary policy of Sayyid took place. The demonstrators demanded Saad's resignation, an end to the unilateral foreign policy, the expulsion of the provocateur Sayyid Zia from Iran, the purge of the state apparatus of Reza Shah's agents and foreigners, and the creation of Anjuman. On November 9, Saad's government was forced to resign. The democratic movement in Iran covered more and more sections of the population. More than 500,000 people took part in demonstrations and rallies in the autumn of 1944. The democratic movement also spread to the southern and western regions of Iran: Isfahan, Yezd, Shiraz, Sultanabad, Avaz, Kermanshah, where the authority and influence of the People's Party, trade unions and the democratic press increased significantly. Sayyid Zia's organization, Watan, with an openly reactionary program, was unable to resist the democratic movement and actually went bankrupt. Under these conditions, at the beginning of 1945, Sayyid Zia announced the organization of a new party, Iradi Milli National Will, and proclaimed a new democratic program, in which he demagogically presented himself as a supporter of freedom, progress and reforms, advocating the use of the latest achievements of culture and civilization, science and technology, for the development of education and health, and speaking out even against religious superstitions. But this trick, calculated on the gullibility of the masses, failed, and Sayyid Zia's attempt to expand his organization in this way failed. The Iradi Milli Party included basically the same people who used to be in Vatan. Under the new name, the Sayyids continued to act with their old methods of slanderous propaganda and provocations. During the Soviet-Iranian negotiations on the oil issue, Sayyid Zia showed himself to be a vicious enemy of the USSR. He no longer pretended to be a friend of the Soviet Union, and his newspapers began to openly conduct a continuous vile anti-Soviet campaign. Convinced of the impossibility of undermining the influence of democratic organizations on the masses through the slanderous propaganda of Sayyid Zia, the Iranian reaction, encouraged by the imperialist forces, already from the end of 1944 switched to terrorist, pogrom, fascist methods of struggle against the trade unions, the People's Party, and other progressive democratic organizations. On February 2, 1945, in Yezd, trade unions and the People's Party celebrated the anniversary of the killing of the well-known Iranian democratic figure, Dr. Irani, in the Reza Shah prison. A group of hooligans bribed by the reactionaries, supporters of Sayyid Zia, with the assistance of the police and the gendarmerie, broke into the club of trade unions and the People's Party. destroyed and set fire to it. On March 27, 1945, a pogrom was organized by the Isfahan Committee of the People's Party and the Council of Trade Unions. The apartments of the leaders of the People's Party were also destroyed. At the same time, in order to undermine the influence of the trade unions of Isfahan, which is the largest center of the Iranian textile industry with its 9 large textile factories, the Sayyids, manufacturers and the police created the so-called Union of Workers and Entrepreneurs in order to draw workers into its ranks. The manufacturers temporarily raised the wages of the members of this alliance and gave them a number of small handouts. At the same time, the reactionary gangs of the Sayyids hunted for the activists of the People's Party and trade unions. They were caught and beaten on city streets, in restaurants and other public places. The pogroms in Yazd and Isfahan were the beginning of an offensive of reaction against the labor and general democratic movement throughout Iran. Raids on organizations of the People's Party and trade unions and the beating of their leaders began to take place in many cities and regions of Iran, in Avaz, Hamadan, Semnan, Sharqi and other places. This rampant reaction was accompanied by a hostile campaign against the USSR. The reactionary, especially Sayyid newspapers, using the connivance of the authorities, printed dirty slander directed against the USSR. In Isfahan, during the pogrom of democratic organizations on March 27, 1945, vile fascist inscriptions addressed to the USSR appeared on the city walls. In the northern regions of Iran bordering on the USSR, the Sayyids systematically organized anti-Soviet provocations, armed bandit and hooligan elements, and provoked clashes. In Tehran, Tabriz and other places, attacks were made on employees of Soviet institutions and on Soviet citizens. Sidovites and Iranian reactionary circles, as a whole, dared to take such impudent fascist, anti-democratic and anti-Soviet actions only because influential imperialist circles stood behind them and pushed them to these actions, hoping in this way to strengthen their positions in Iran and prevent rapprochement between Iran and the USSR. The patrons and instigators of Iranian reaction were no longer only British imperialist circles, but also American imperialists, who began to show great interest in Iran, especially in its oil resources. During the Second World War, taking advantage of the expulsion of the Germans from Iran and the weakening of England, the Americans significantly strengthened their positions here. During the years of the war, the most intensive American penetration into Iran took place during the tenure of Qavam as Prime Minister, from August 9, 1942, to February 13, 1943. Iran. On April 8, 1943, the Iranian-American trade treaty prepared by Qavam was signed in Washington. The contract was concluded for a period of 3 years, and it was established that if 6 months before the expiration of this period its denunciation is not announced, then the term of the contract will be automatically extended. The agreement provided for the establishment of the most favored nation principle in relation to the importation of goods, the collection of customs duties, taxes, fees, etc. Tables of reduced customs duties were attached to the agreement, which should be levied when importing American goods into Iran: cars, tires, spare parts, electrical appliances, food products, etc., and Iranian goods to America, mainly carpets and agricultural raw materials. Commenting on the signing of this treaty, Iranian newspapers noted that it was aimed at ensuring that the United States in Iran's foreign trade had the same position that Germany had before the Second World War. During the war years, the U.S. share in Iran's foreign trade more than doubled, and in 1944-45 it already amounted to 23.3% of Iran's foreign trade turnover, ranking second after India, 30%. The Qavam government also invited a number of American military and economic missions and advisors to Iran, with the help of which the United States hoped to bring various areas of Iran's economic and socio-political life under its control. At the end of 1942, without any contractual or any other formalization, the United States sent its troops to Iran, numbering several tens of thousands of people, under the guise of ensuring the delivery of military cargo to the USSR. The Americans took control of the southern section of the Trans-Iranian Railway and the South Iranian ports of Bandar Shapa and Khorramshahr. A special American military camp, Amrabad, was built in the vicinity of Tehran. American soldiers behaved in Iran as in their colony, cheeky and unbridled. They misbehaved on the streets, rowdy in restaurants, broke into private houses and committed violence there. By agreement with the government of Kavam, the U.S. Department of War sent Major General Ridley with a group of American officers to Iran as an advisor to the Iranian army. The American military mission began its activities in the Iranian army on March 21, 1943. Although it was originally established that the mission would be in Iran only during the war, in fact, after the war, it not only remained there, but even more intensively deployed its activity. The government of Kavam also invited advisors from the United States for the Iranian gendarmerie. Gendarmerie advisors, headed by Colonel and then General Schwarzkopf, the former New Jersey police chief in the United States, began their activities in Iran on October 2, 1942 on the basis of a 2-year contract. In 1944 and 1946 the agreement governing their stay and activities was extended for the next 2 years. The agreement on the employment of American officers to lead the Iranian gendarmerie, signed in 1943 by Foreign Minister Saad, provided that the head of the mission of American officers was also the chief commander of the Iranian gendarme organization, that he would enjoy the right of precedence over all Iranian gendarmerie officers, and that in his immediate duties will include all management and all control over the gendarmerie. Under Article 21 of the treaty, the Iranian government undertook not to hire any other foreign officers to serve in the gendarmerie. The Iranian gendarmerie was supplied with weapons and all materials from America. An American uniform was even introduced for the Iranian gendarmerie. Under the leadership of American officers, the Iranian gendarmerie became one of the main instruments of reaction in the struggle against the democratic movement in Iran. Americans were appointed advisors to the Iranian police, the Ministry of Health, the Ministry of Food and Irrigation. Reappeared in Iran and Milspo. On December 12, 1942, the Iranian Majlis, at the suggestion of the government of Kavam Sultan, approved the law on the second invitation of Milspo to the post of Chief Administrator of Iranian Finances. By this law, Milspo was given extremely wide rights in the field of Iran's finances. He was entrusted with the preparation of the state budget and control over its execution, control over all payments and financial obligations of the government, appointment, removal, promotion and demotion of officials of financial and other public institutions that are on the state budget. Milspo received the right of unlimited access to all documents, reports, books and accounts, the right to submit bills to the Iranian government on finding new sources of income, on changing existing financial laws, on developing the country's economy, etc. All Iran's finances, therefore, were placed under the control of Milspo. The Milspo mission could serve as a very powerful tool for the enslavement of Iran by the United States, and U.S. imperialist circles placed great hopes in it. Even before Milspo left the U.S. for Iran, he was told by the State Department that after the war, the U.S. will have to play a larger role in the Middle East with regard to oil, trade and air transport, and that this program is already in place. The State Department and Milspo himself did not even try to hide the fact that the Milspo mission, like other American missions and individual American advisors in Iran, is an instrument of American policy in Iran. Thus, George Allen, head of the Middle East section of the U.S. Department of State, then U.S. ambassador to Iran, openly wrote in July 1944 in the Bulletin of the State Department that the various American missions of advisors in Iran were an important instrument of the policy of the American government, which he hypocritically called politics. Aid to Iran. But Millspaugh and the American imperialists, who stood behind him, were not satisfied with the very wide financial powers granted to him, considering them insufficient for complete subjugation of the Iranian economy. Therefore, Millspaugh, who arrived in Iran in January 1943, immediately demanded that the Iranian government expand its already extensive rights and powers. On May 4, 1943, the Iranian Majlis approved a law on Millspaugh's emergency powers in the field of finance and economics. The validity of the law was provided until the expiration of 6 months after the end of the war. According to this law, in addition to control over all state revenues and expenditures, over the collection of taxes and customs duties, the preparation and execution of the state budget, Millspaugh's powers were also extended to foreign and domestic trade, procurement, storage and distribution of industrial and food products, transport, state industrial enterprises, for wages, rents, price controls, etc. Thus, not only all financial affairs, but almost the entire economy of Iran was placed under the control of Millspaugh. Millspaugh created numerous new departments: grain and grain, transport, distribution of goods, price stabilization, foreign trade control, operation of state industrial enterprises, state estates, personnel, accounting and audits. All these departments were headed by Americans appointed by Millspaugh. The number of Americans in the Millspaugh mission, by April 1944, had already reached 52 people. But Millspaugh's imperialist appetites grew more and more. The American imperialist circles, whose interests were reflected by Millspaugh, sought to use his mission in order to completely enslave and subjugate Iran. At the end of 1943, during a conference of the leaders of the three great powers in Tehran, in a conversation with Millspaugh, President Roosevelt and Hopkins discussed the need to expand the powers and extend the duration of his mission in Iran by at least 20 years. The American imperialists wanted the Millspaugh mission to become the de facto government of Iran. Although, Millspaugh wrote on August 25, 1944, in a letter to Morris, the American ambassador to Iran, the real position of the mission can be somewhat disguised in order to spare the feelings of the Iranians. But the mission should be in reality the government of the country in the field of financial, economic and public affairs. In 1943, Millspaugh drew up a draft law on inviting new American advisors to the ministries of communications, agriculture, post, and telegraph. Millspaugh's mission and the new departments and institutions he created brought great harm to Iran. Enormous sums were spent on the maintenance of American advisors, who received salaries 6 to 7 times higher than the Iranian officials corresponding to them in rank, and on the departments created by Millspaugh. Millspaugh's activities not only failed to strengthen the finances and economy of Iran, but, on the contrary, led to their collapse. The wrecking machinations of Millspaugh in drawing up the state budget were so obvious that even the Majlis of the 14th Convocation, which consisted of a majority of reactionary deputies, refused to approve the draft budgets submitted by Millspaugh. In this regard, during the years of Millspaugh's stay in Iran, the state budget was never approved by the Majlis. Government revenue has declined. For 9 months, from March 21 to December 21, 1944, the amount of ordinary state revenues decreased by $23 million, compared with the same period of the previous year. In order to appreciate the significance of this amount, it should be pointed out that in the 1942-43 fiscal year, the total ordinary income of Iran amounted to only $83 million. The expenditure part of the budget systematically exceeded the income. On December 21, 1943, the budget deficit for ordinary income and expenses amounted to $8 million. The next year, on December 21, 1944, $7 million. The industrial and commercial part of the budget, state factories, plants, etc., reduced to an even greater deficit. Iranian state factories for the year, from March 21, 1944 to March 20, 1945, gave a loss of 650 million rials. This loss was caused by the irresponsibility, abuse and theft of the people running the state factories. The amount of paper money in circulation more than doubled. If before Milspo's arrival in Iran, in November 1942, there were banknotes worth 3.5 billion rials in circulation, then by January 5, 1945, their number had increased to 7.6 billion rials. The debt of the government to the Iranian National Bank increased only during the period from January 5 to December 6, 1944, from 3,741 million to 4,445 million rials. Commodity prices rose unusually high. During the 2 years of Milspo's rule in Iran, 1942-43 and 1943-44, the price index rose from 339 to 1,108 compared with the prices of 1936-37, taken as 100. The population was extremely unsatisfactorily supplied with food and industrial goods. Residents of many districts and regions have not received a meter of cloth or a kilogram of sugar for years. Under these conditions, speculation flourished. Milspo himself contributed to the development of speculation and the prosperity of the black market, providing his supporters from the reactionary camp with huge quantities of goods at fixed prices, which they then resold on the black market. So, in May 1944, Milspo provided the closest henchman of Sayed Zia, the reactionary merchant Rashid Yang. 900,000 m of manufactory, at a fixed price of 10.5 rials per meter. Rashid Yang then sold this manufactory on the black market for 54 rials per meter, making a net profit of over 39 million rials. This amount went to finance the reactionary anti-Soviet activities of Sayed Zia and his gang, except for the part that fell into the pocket of Rashidian's benefactors. The fact that American advisors did not disdain taking bribes is widely known in Iran. For example, on April 16, 1944, the Tehran newspaper Egdam reported that the head of the Price Stabilization Department, the American Lamb, received a bribe in the amount of 5 million rials from the Catane Company, and the head of the Department for the Distribution of Goods, the American Ferguson, received from the company Larry a bribe of 3 million rials. The newspaper further wrote that these facts were connected with the closure for a long time of a large state store in Tehran, which sold fabrics at state prices. Milspo deliberately ruined the Iranian economy in order to pave the way for the enslavement of Iran by the American imperialists, and to force a weakened Iran to apply to the American bankers for a loan. On March 2, 1944, the Tehran newspaper, Mer Iran, reported that Milspo offered to receive a loan in America in the amount of $40 million. However, then Milspo was unable to impose an American loan on Iran, ruining the Iranian economy. Milspo, just like 20 years ago, tried in 1944 to secure concessions for American companies to exploit Iranian oil. Following Milspo, numerous representatives of British and American oil companies arrived in Iran, who negotiated with the Iranian government on obtaining oil concessions. Thus, Milspo was not satisfied only with the undermining of the Iranian economy and various machinations in the financial and economic field. He also interfered in the political affairs of Iran. He closely associated with Sayed Zia and other reactionary groups, and tried through them to direct Iran's foreign policy along an anti-Soviet path. Milspo's activity caused indignation among the Iranian public. Even many right-wing newspapers, groups and figures repeatedly exposed Milspo's machinations and demanded his resignation. In an effort to create some kind of support for himself, Milspo bribed the reactionary, corrupt state officials, newspaper editors, and deputies of the Mejlis. He supplied them with large quantities of scarce goods, provided them with profitable deals, distributed among them scarce tires for cars, etc. In order to influence the press in the spirit that pleased him. Milspo deprived the democratic publications of state announcements, which were one of the main incomes of newspapers. These announcements were sent only to the reactionary press that supported him. But all these machinations did not help Milspo. He was supported only by Sayedzia and foreign agents and reactionaries like him. The subversive economic and political activities of Milspo took such scandalous forms and caused such violent protests in the most diverse social and political strata of Iran that on January 8, 1945, the Iranian Majlis passed a law depriving him of his emergency powers. On February 8, 1945, Iranian Prime Minister Bayat stated in the Majlis that the government had already decided on the resignation of Milspo. Milspo's activities and results were so scandalous and discredited U.S. policy and American plans in Iran so much that the State Department did not dare to open diplomatic pressure on the Iranian government in favor of Milspo. The American imperialists hoped to carry out their plans for the subjugation of Iran by other ways and means. On February 28, 1945, Milspo left Iran. The activation of the American imperialists, relying on the reactionary circles of Iran, strengthened the positions of the latter. In the face of the American imperialists, the Iranian reactionaries saw new and stronger patrons and allies than the British imperialists in the struggle against Iranian democracy and in pursuing an anti-Soviet foreign policy. In the struggle against democracy, the Iranian reactionaries and the foreign circles that supported them tried to use nomads, mainly the South Iranian tribes, the Kashkai, Bakhshia, Lurs, Arab tribes, etc. Under Reza Shah. These tribes were disarmed and forcibly transferred to settled life, which led to the mass death of livestock, the main source of existence of nomads. The tribes were subordinated to the governors and mainly the commanders of the military and gendarme units sent to these regions, who abused their power and oppressed the nomads. The tribes, therefore, did not gain anything from the restriction of the rights of feudal khans and leaders carried out by Reza Shah. After the abdication of Reza Shah, the khans, the leaders of many tribes, returned from exile. The tribes returned to their former nomadic way of life. The regions of southwestern Iran, inhabited by nomadic tribes, again turned into feudal possessions, the rulers of which, the khans, the leaders of the tribes, had little regard for the central Iranian government, with its representatives and orders. The Kashkai, Bakhshia, and other khans again had their own armed detachments. They refused to recognize the officials appointed by Tehran, entered into armed battles with each other, introduced their own taxes. With the support of the British, the khans sometimes sought their official appointment as governors of the regions inhabited by the tribes they led. In relation to the subordinate population, the khans established a regime of complete arbitrariness.